welcome to Beauties and Beasties, the independent pest podcast for the UK.
Hello. How are we doing today?
Hi, Alex. Yeah, not too bad, thanks. Have you recovered from last week's podcast?
Oh, yes, just about. So for anyone who didn't see last week's podcast, I had my father on the podcast, which was a wonderful experience to be able to share this podcast with my dad, but also a very nerve-wracking experience for me as he, spilt all of the beans on the me getting up to my youth and working with him when I was younger. So like I say, it's I've always been super proud of the fact that I've been able to work with my old man, but at the same time, it's always been I don't know. It's always nerve-wracking having a family member on, isn't it, to do the podcasts with you? How about you? I mean, you've worked with your son for a long old time, haven't you?
I was going to say I have asked him to actually come on with me, and he's been a bit like chuff off. I have you in my ear all week anyway, so why would I choose to spend my Friday night with you? Yes, Niall, it was a bloody red alert. I wonder what the hell it was.
What was a red alert? What happened?
A massive, severe alert from the UK government.
Yes, I was about to say. I mean, we've got yellow weather warning, but anywhere on the west coast at the moment, you've got a severe weather alert looking for it. So,
nearly blew me flipping eardrums out.
Oh Christ! Really? I thought that's something I'd done. Well, Hugh, if you have to leave halfway through, then please, get into your canoe and paddle away.
Get down into my air raid shelter.
Well, yeah, you are old enough to have one of those, aren't you? So, an old Anderson's shelter in the garden.
Where my dad my dad died this year, but he's got the three houses together, and all my granddad, his brother, and his brother lived in three houses, and in the back of the middle house was a air raid shelter made into a castle, and it's still there. Yeah.
Was it made into a castle before or after? Like, did the war finish?
Same time.
Oh, we're not going to know this now. At the time.
At the same time. It was all done at the same time. So you can walk up on top of it, and there's like a little patio area on the top. Well, concrete area.
Yeah, let's turn our air raid shelter into a feature for the garden. Excellent stuff. Oh, yeah, I really like that. That's awesome. So yeah, how's work been? You were saying that you've been busy at the moment.
It's mental.
I mean, is it just seasonal things, or just what's going on?
Squirrels and rats at the moment, plus the fact that same as everybody else with any contract services, you're chasing around trying to get your last visits of the year in and balance out running out of work with having too much work with do you take any more work on. So that's the big cycle at the moment of turning people away, but making sure that everybody that you normally uses you is also kept happy.
Yeah, so it's got to be all fun and games, and then you've got to make sure that all your CPD's up to date as well. Done that. Go on then. Which of your
used to call it
the highest D score then? Who's winning? Who's got the golden spoon?
We used to call the last cycle of the year chasing the eights.
Okay.
Because it was 8 routines per year on 6 weekly cycles. So the end of the year you were chasing the eights.
It sounds a lot cooler than it is.
Yeah.
It's a very cool name for a lot of headache.
Who's got the most CPD?
Who's got the most CPD?
I would actually guess probably me this year.
Oh.
Purely
or just sitting there reading a lot of books?
reading, and because I'm sat here anyway on my, as they would say, everybody would say, I can join in the webinars and various other things. Whereas, if you're out in the field, it's hard to dedicate time to be doing that, isn't it?
It is always a bit of a challenge. So go on then, this year, what has been the best set of webinars that you've managed to sit in and listen on? What's the ones that really, really struck you? For people listening back, if they're looking for another couple of CPD points, where would you recommend? What was one that's really stuck with you?
I can't think of one that sticks out in my brain particularly, to be honest. You only learn, that sounds a bit, I think the BPCA forum one was quite good. I can't remember which one it was, but I remember coming away from it and thinking, yeah, I did actually learn something then. So yeah, I can't remember exactly which one it was. It all, at this age, it all ends up into a mush.
All right. So you've got the most CPD points, you just can't remember anything about them.
Can't remember what I had for dinner yesterday.
Awesome stuff.
I would never take another exam, put it that way.
Well, that's an interesting point that we'll save for another podcast down the way. Where we're going to be going.
I can remember stuff that I did when I was 21. Absolutely no problem at all.
I think that's called Alzheimer's, man.
Right, I want to see a guest. I don't want to talk to you any longer.
I don't want to talk to you anymore. I don't want to be a part of this. You're just being mean. So, okay, with that, let's not. I'm just getting my own back because I had an entire podcast of this last week. I had both Sean and my dad ganging up on me and to tell them stories of my Matrix boots and my going to go drinking in the woods.
Oh yes, and your skinhead haircut.
My skinhead haircut, absolutely. So yeah, if anyone wants a good Christmas giggle at my expense, go back and have a listen to last week's podcast. I guarantee you won't be disappointed. You might be a little disappointed in me, but you won't be disappointed.
I shan't repeat what he said about you. You'll have to watch it.
No, absolutely.
It was entertaining, to say the least.
Everyone else but me. Oh dear. So with that, shall we bring on a guest who's probably not going to throw me underneath the bus? She may do. I don't know. We have some fantastic adventures out in the States. But without further ado, let's bring on Jasmin from Fotolec. Hi, Jasmin. How you doing?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm all good. I'm sorry. I realised then I basically gave you the best part of about 3.5 seconds before we brought you on, so good catch there.
No, I was ready. Well, I was thinking about all the ways I could throw you under the bus. Never traveling with you again, by the way, because your bad luck always seems to pass on to me. So there we go.
A little bit of context for that. I always write these, fantastic stories and bits of a giggle and tell everyone, the terrors I have when I travel. And I'm sure a lot of people will think I'm just sort of like exaggeration or hyperbole or anything like that. But Jasmin can attest, because she's now been on 2 flights with me. The first flight of which, what was it, less than 15-20 minutes into a 13-hour flight, the lady in front of me threw an entire pot of scalding coffee into my lap. Yeah, that was a hoot.
But I didn't actually know what had happened. I just saw you suddenly like jump up, and I was like, "Oh God, this isn't starting well."
Of course, was it? And the great thing about that was she was genuinely mortified. The lady sat in front of me. She put her seat back too fast and too hard, and it literally knocked the cup off my seat table all over my lap. And bless her, she turned around and was like, "Is there anything I can do?" And my brain just went, no. What could you possibly do to assist at this point? Do you have some kind of like magical time machine? So that was that. And then the second, I'll let you tell a bit of the story about the second journey, because when did we set off from Frankfurt? When was it? It was about, when did we get to the airport?
Oh, we got to the airport, I guess, between 5 and 6 p.m. because we was due to fly out at 8 p.m, weren't we? And then we were very delayed, which happens. But unfortunately, we ended up basically not landing in the correct London airport because London City Airport closed before we could actually get there. Thanks to, was the guy drunk?
Yeah, there was someone on our plane that was so drunk he gave himself a nosebleed, and the captain came out and just went, "I'm not getting into the air when you're like this. You know, you're bleeding and also drunk. Get off the plane." But it wasn't just a case of get off the plane. We had to get they had to send a bus out there. They had to get all his kit off the back. Not to mention the fact that he was being super argumentative about all of this. So by the time we got into the air, like the London City Airport, which has a noise abatement, they won't let planes come in and out after a certain time, just basically told us when we were in the air, "Nah, sorry, can't land, gonna have to redirect." And they redirected us to Luton, which couldn't be any further from any of the other London airports. It's halfway, halfway past the Watford Gap. And that was it, because at the point, Jasmine's car was in London, and there's no public transport links coming out of Luton. So I had to phone for a lift. When did we land? It was about midnight. So someone had to drive out and pick me up, which didn't get. And then Jasmine had to get you had to get like a transfer bus, didn't you?
Yeah, we were on this coach and it took literally over 2 hours to get to Luton. So it's like 2 a.m. by the time we all get there. No, sorry, London City. And then our cars were stuck in the car park. There was nobody working and we had to pay £150 to raise the barrier because it was like a new day for our prepaid parking and there was no one to speak to. So it was quite expensive and incredibly late getting home. So yeah, I will definitely, next time there's an exhibition we're both attending, I will find out what flight you're on and go on a different one, I think.
I'm going to be honest with you. Don't nod your head, Hugh.
Sounds like a plan.
It's always an adventure when you go traveling with me. Things happen. Flights are missed, planes are redirected, illegally entering other countries, but that's a story for an entirely different time. But we weren't. Yeah, that is definitely a story for another time.
I was going to say, I know nothing about that.
I once went to the wrong country by accident. So that was good fun. Hey-ho, there we go. But we're not here to talk about travel adventures. What are we here to talk about today?
We are here to talk about retrofit LED, namely our new innovation Opti-Catch, which you've both seen and sampled.
We have.
Essentially, what we've done is develop an LED lamp that will fit directly into existing fluorescent traps. We started with the equivalent of a 15-watt T8 because it's the most popular, but we do hope to develop a full range, a full retrofit family. Essentially, what we're quite passionate about is that perfectly good functional traps should not needlessly go to landfill when customers wish to benefit from the energy efficiency of LED, or perhaps they are fearful of upcoming legislation, which maybe we can touch on later regarding fluorescent lamps. So what we essentially have developed is a product where you're not compromising your fly catch, you're saving around 66% of your energy, and you are still catching flies and using your existing equipment without the costly install of totally replacing the whole trap.
So Fotolec have been around for a very long time, haven't they?
Yeah, I don't think, I think people will have been unknowingly using our products in the industry for many years now. So we, our main product that we specialize in is shatterproof coatings for fluorescent lamps. So whenever you have an atmosphere whereby you can't risk glass contamination, usually the food industry, anywhere like that where there's food preparation or handling or manufacturing, we apply an FEP shatterproof coating to the fluorescent lamps, which means in the event of accidental breakage, all of the glass and the phosphors are contained. We are partners with the British Retail Consortium, and so we've always sort of serviced the food industry. And of course, pest control, namely insect light traps, are a really big part of that. They're a really big user of shatterproof lamps. So we've been around.
Weren't you the first weren't you the first company to do shatterproof tubes?
In
Way back.
the UK, I would say so. I mean, it's quite before my time, so I don't want to misquote, but in the UK, I believe we were, yes.
I was going to say, because I remember when I worked for another a company, that I can seem to remember back in my head then the name Fotolec, when shatterproof tubes first came onto the scene, because once upon a time with the old SS units, not that thing, it was a type of fly killer. It wasn't a storm. It was, a type of fly killers that you didn't have a shatterproof option at all. And I seem to be able to remember in the distant past when they first came in and there was a big push for shatterproof tubes everywhere.
Yeah,
I'm sure it was Fotolec.
It's mostly kind of targeted at the food industry, but actually I'd argue anywhere where you really don't fancy sweeping up a load of glass when you're replacing the bulbs, it's worthwhile having a coating. So yeah, that's kind of our main business. That's how we sort of primarily service the pest control industry. But of course, with the technology change between fluorescent and LED, there's a lot coming to market which warrants an entire new trap with the costly installs and things like that. So we're now kind of looking more at retrofit LED, which of course all of our Opti-Catch products do have the FEP shatterproof coating included. So you're still benefiting from a glass-free environment.
I mean, I've got a question for Hugh before we get into the nitty-gritty of this. How many sites? I know I'm gonna put your math skills to the test here. How many sites do you service EFKs on? Ballpark.
Between 80 and 150.
Yeah. How many like EFKs are on those on average? You know, between 5 and 50.
To be honest, the average would probably be 1.
Okay, but still, that puts your number anywhere between 80 and several hundred EFK units. I mean, that's a fairly stunning outlay of steel and electronics, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we have been sort of really like, oh, if we have to go to all these customers and sell them an LED unit specifically, there's going to be quite a few, and we that aren't going to be too happy when we tell them they've got to buy 35, 40 new fly killers over the next XYZ years. So, in fact, we actually did pick up one contract because another person was pushing so hard for LED units that they just couldn't. They were like, we can't justify it. We want an option. So,
and this kind of brings me on to my first question for Jasmin, which is there is a lot of pest managers out there pushing towards LED because there is this assumption we've all heard of the ban of fluorescent tubes coming in. They're being banned. We can't use them anymore. They're bad news, full stop. But there is a lot of misinformation around that particular ban, isn't it? So can you actually give us a little bit more details? Because this is your ban. But I mean, what is the long and the short of it? It's the Rothschild ban or the Roth? What's the actual name of the ban?
The actual ban is the Roth ban, so it's the restriction of hazardous substances. And I think that a lot of the kind of, I don't want to say fear mongering, but a lot of the fears in market stem from the fact that general lighting fluorescent lamps were indeed banned last year because there are many different retrofit solutions in LED. That means it's comfortable to phase out general lighting fluorescent lamps. And I think that there needs to be more emphasis on the divide between general lighting and special lighting, because special lighting is the umbrella under which UVA lamps fall, which is obviously what we use for attracting insects in ILTs. And so special lighting does have a kind of Roche pathway. There will be an eventual ban, but we are considerably behind the general lighting space in terms of our pathway to LED. And retrofit is a really big part of that because, like you've kind of identified there with your numbers, if all of the traps in market that are utilizing fluorescent lamps suddenly could not be serviced, that's going to be a huge amount of waste going to landfill, and actually it's not sustainable. That's not an environmentally friendly approach to, you know, reducing mercury use, which is what it ultimately is all about. It's about eliminating the use of mercury. So there is a planned ROSH review date in 2027 for, you know, to review special lighting as a whole. So that's not just UVA for insects, that includes UVC, which is used for water and air purification, and UVB, which is also like suntan lamps and things like that. So there is a planned review. It does not mean there's a definitive ban in 2027. And actually, more than one of the large manufacturers of fluorescent lamps in Europe have already pledged or requested an extension of the EU, because they rightly say the market cannot cope with a ban that soon. I mean, it's the end of 2024 now. So what they've actually requested is a 5-year extension, which would take us to 2032. Simply by asking for an extension, you do get 12 months as standard. So the absolute earliest we would expect to see any kind of phase out of production of fluorescent lamps is actually 2028, because that extension has been requested. But it's really important to remember that that's a production ban date. That doesn't mean that stock immediately is not on the shelves from then. Will they
ramp up production coming up to that date, do you think?
So
there are stockpiles?
If I think back to the general lighting ban that we witnessed last year, there's still stock available now, and the ban date was actually September 2023. So we're still, you know, we're 14 months on from then, and we can still get general lighting fluorescent lamps because there was such a stockpile, as you say, before the ban date occurred. So yeah, fluorescent will be readily available for, you know, years to come. So it's not right, I think, you know, you say some people are really pushing an LED upgrade that perhaps is not cost effective for the customer. Perhaps they've not long bought their fluorescent traps and they want to really kind of get as much bang for their buck out of those before they buy new equipment. There's actually no need to rush to buy new LED units. And I think that's something that I feel quite strongly about, is not perhaps effectively communicated in market. Now, obviously, there are benefits to upgrading to LED. The biggest one would be the energy savings, which is why Opti-Catch is a really good solution, because you're not compromising your fly catch, because we've got a unique diffusion FUP coating, which actually distributes the light and the UV more evenly to kind of mimic a fluorescent lamp. You probably know that a lot of the LED traps that you see in the market are very sort of spotty and directional. And so what that means is there may be, you know, a shed load of UV coming out directly in front of the chips. But if the insects don't happen to be flying exactly there, and then perhaps a little bit higher or lower than the trap, they may not actually be attracted as effectively. So that diffusion coating does increase fly catch and does actually improve the efficacy of the product, as well as obviously the energy saving. So you go from 15 watts down to 5 watts, which is a 66% energy saving. So it's good to upgrade to LED, but it doesn't need to be ripping a perfectly good trap off of the wall and replacing it with something new.
So Jasmin, I just have a quick question before we talk about energy and power usage and the rest of it, because that's also really another fascinating part of this. But it's my understanding that with the ban, ban inverted commas, but with the reduction in the number of standard fluorescent tubes being bought, a lot of the price point of fluorescent tubes, or even UV fluorescent tubes, was they shared a phenomenal number of common componentry. So the starters, let's say the end caps, even all the way down to the pins that you use to install them. Now, because we have lost that manufacturing capacity of standard tubes, does that mean that we are going to start to see a point-by-point increase in the cost of UV fluorescent tubes as all of those component parts start to become, we lose that economy of scale, and by virtue of that, our specialist bulbs will, over this time period between now and 27 or 30, become progressively more expensive as unit for unit, they become less cost effective to manufacture? Or is that just a fallacy?
I think you're right, but I think we've already seen a lot of that, because if you imagine that as the general lighting ban was getting closer and closer, more and more customers in market were already moving over to LED. Perhaps they were having a renovation in their premises, and they wouldn't be buying new fluorescent fittings for several years before the ban took place, because there were good LED alternatives. So the efficiencies that were gained by the general lighting space were at their lowest point right before that ban came in. So we were kind of already suffering from that in the special lighting space. Now, it goes without saying that as you lose efficiency, as you lose fluorescent volume, of course, that needs to be recovered. So, the price of fluorescent is likely to increase, but I don't think it's going to jump up as significantly as perhaps one would think, given that we've already had, a very gradual decrease of the general lighting fluorescents. And don't forget, it's actually only a European ban, Europe and Great Britain. So there's still a lot of fluorescent lamps in general lighting being used in America, for one example, Africa, other parts of the world. So the factories that are producing these fluorescent lamps aren't just supplying Europe. Not only that, as the cost of fluorescent increases, because of other factors, we don't actually know what the cost of LEDs are going to do. So it may be that they both go up kind of like together, or it could be that as the LED technology increases in volume, LED comes down a little bit, fluorescent goes up a little bit, and that price gap does start to narrow, which only makes the decision a bit more easy, doesn't it? Because as soon as that price point kind of gets a bit closer, it makes your decision to upgrade a little bit more in favor of LED. But also just bear in mind that, we buy fluorescent lamps from the major manufacturers that you would expect us to buy from, and pricing is actually fixed till the end of 2025. So obviously there's not an immediate plan to pass on some cost increases as a result of reduced efficiencies.
So I've got a weird question. With the standardization of like leads and things like that, there was talk about there were so many different types of leads. Why do we have so many different types of fly killer tubes? Why don't we just have one standard tube that fits everything, a 15-watt tube? Or is that a bit off in the distance?
I think that the reason, so I guess you're talking about all the different LED solutions that all have different fixings,
no, even not necessarily, just ordinary fluorescent, like you've got circline tubes, and then you've got a fly killer that takes 3 5-watt tubes, and then you've got a 22-watt tube, and you've got a 40-watt tube, and you've got a 60-watt tube. Why didn't we ever just decide to standardize everything to a 18-inch, 1-inch round, 15-watt tube?
I think that would be a lot more simple, definitely. There's different UV outputs across the different envelope styles and fluorescent. So the output of, you mentioned a circline, the UV output of a circline may differ to the UV output of a linear 18-inch fluorescent. Also, you've got kind of aesthetic to take into consideration. I think there are some people that want their trap to look a certain way, and so there are some more decorative fixtures that perhaps need a different shape or style of lamp. But certainly you would think that a universal approach would be much easier for everyone to manage.
I mean, talking from a physics point of view, I can understand why there are different tubes, because they'd actually do different things. Because if you think about it, the way in which it produces light is you are superheating mercury and phosphorus within inside that tube in a low pressure environment, which means that actually that if you alter the surface area, so the amount of phosphorus, and by increasing and decreasing the diameter of the circumference of a tube, you actually increase and decrease the amount of phosphorus that is exposed to that. It will have significantly different effects on the light and the wavelength output from that for different So it's science. And as with all of these things, I'm sure the different manufacturers want to absolutely convinced that a T18, fitting is the future. And everyone's like, but T15 is easier to manufacture. So I can understand
Such a pain when you're doing an order. Such a pain when you do your yearly annual tube change order. It's like, how many T8s do we want? How many circ lines do we want? Who's got 50? Who's got a 20-watt tube? Oh, it would be so much easier.
But I would say that actually in fluorescent, that's easier than what it's about to be an LED, because if you think at least all of the fluorescent options you have, you can buy from anywhere, any of your kind of suppliers are going to have a stock of various shapes and sizes of fluorescent lamps, whereas in the LED space, they've all got different connections. And so it's actually going to be probably more difficult because you're going to have to buy different things from different places potentially. So I think that problem you have there, Hugh, might only get worse, actually, which again is why I'm just bringing good news for you, which is again why when we developed Opti-Catch, we wanted a bit more of a kind of universal lamp form factor, because we think it's what the industry is already used to handling. It looks familiar. It kind of installs exactly as you would expect it to usually install, like a fluorescent lamp would. And again, it reduces that confusion of what have I got? What do I need to buy? Which I think is only going to become more prevalent with all the different fixtures that are coming to market in the LED space.
So on to myth number 2, because I feel tonight is going to be a lot of myth busting, and we need to, when you put this up, Hugh, we need to probably relabel it, LED myth busters. But this is one that I see coming up a lot, and there's a lot of confusion around how often LED tubes need to be swapped out compared to how often fluorescent tubes need to be swapped out. And you have some people saying you should still do it annually. Other times I've heard 3 years is fine. Other times I've heard 5 years, will be absolutely fine. But of course, what are the factors that lead into this? What's the reality of this myth? That's what I'm asking.
The reality of it is every product is going to have a different answer to that question. And the reason I say that is, for example, Opti-Catch is a 3-year product with a 3-year warranty. And at the end of those 3 years, the amount of UV degradation that would have occurred would mimic the UV degradation that would have occurred after 1 year of a fluorescent lamp. So you're kind of comparing apples with apples. The point at which a fluorescent lamp becomes less effective is kind of like for like with the 3-year mark on the Opti-Catch product. But you do have to be careful because it's not the same for every single LED solution. The main reason being is the circuitry is different in every product. The quality of the components inside is going to be different. The actual, UV output of the chips from day one is going to be different depending on, are they, really good quality UV chips? Have they sourced quite poor performing, cheap UV chips? And so it's not really a one size fits all approach, which is where, again, it differs quite massively from fluorescent, because I think it's kind of widely accepted that fluorescent lamp needs changing at that year mark. And you do have to be a lot more cautious with LED. I've seen some other solutions on the market that claim it's a 3-year product, but when you look at the survival data on the data sheet, up to 50% of the chips would be out at that point. And by that point, to me, if you've got, for example, 30 chips and 15 of them are not lit, I consider that unacceptable. As a consumer, I wouldn't be happy with that, being in my establishment. So that's why, Opti-Catch, there's 10 chips in total, and the output at the end of the 3 years would be at basically 70% of the original UV output, which is exactly where it is in fluorescent. At 1 year mark in fluorescent, 70% of the original UV is still being put out by the lamp. And I think, again, that's quite important to differentiate between the lifetimes.
We had a situation, it wasn't with LED tubes, it was with ordinary fluorescent tubes at a BRC site that we do, and we said we change the tubes every year, and they said, why? I'm like, well, because that's industry standard and we do. And they were like, why? Prove it. Why do they need changing every year? And I was like, oh, I don't
It's a good question.
know where that's in writing. And transversely, we were also asked, if we change to these LED tubes, how long do they last? And I was like, well, they last 3 years. And they were like, prove it. What do you mean, prove it? Well, the auditor's going to say, show me some proof that these fly killers, the fly tubes, last 3 years. So with the Opti-Catch, will there be like a statement for the of lasting life, as it were? Of
course. So any good supplier, any good manufacturer is going to have that data available if asked. And the way it's usually presented is on the data sheet. You would expect to see some sort of survival chart, which would show the UV degradation over time and how many hours have passed. So you get that average kind of rated life. But also, usually you'll see it mentioned in LED as like L70B10. And so what that would mean is that, well, it could be L70B10, L90B10, and that basically tells you once X amount of the life has passed, how many of the original chips have failed. So L70B10 would mean that 70% of its way into its rated life, no more than 10% of the chips will have failed, essentially. Go on.
All we want is a little certificate we can stuff in the folder.
Exactly. So the technical data sheet will have a chart that shows you kind of the UV degradation over time. It's a UV maintenance curve, and that would tell you at what point you need to replace the lamps. But you know, you say your customer was asking, why do you replace a fluorescent lamp after 1 year? And I suppose they're asking that because after 1 year, the light could still be illuminated. But of course, we can't see UV. So the light that we can see that's giving off, that's being emitted from a fluorescent lamp isn't necessarily the light that is attracting the insect. And that would be the same, you know, that's just because we cannot see the UV nanometer wave.
I do have some interesting points around light, and I'll bring those up in a bit, but good question that's come in. There used to be that for a little while there was a fad, a craze, a flurry, let's say, of distributors selling little UVA measuring pens, which, yeah, admittedly were a little myth.
You can get one stuck on your phone as well at one stage, wasn't there?
There was, but they were very sort of like, and forgive me for saying that, a fantastic idea, but actually in the field they had a very sort of like variable success rate, let's say. Some of them are better than others, but the question here is would you know, can you recommend a UV measuring tool for technicians? So I'm sure in your labs you have some very sophisticated UV measuring equipment that's probably not conducive to carrying around in a kit bag, or is it? I mean, what's the best way of measuring UV in the field?
That's quite difficult with LED, because if you think about the way that an LED product has diodes running along it in usually a straight line, depending on where you hold the measuring tool, you're going to get a very different reading. And so you could hold it slightly off from where the chips are pointing and think, oh, this isn't quite enough UV. But then equally, if you hold it directly in front of the LEDs, that's going to be a lot of UV, but is that useful UV if it's all just in one place? So again, you know, the diffusion coating we've developed, it's not necessarily about having all the UV pushed directly out to the front, and it kind of spreads the beam and disperses it a little bit more evenly. Now, to answer the question, no, I can't recommend a handheld measuring tool that's going to accurately tell you the efficacy of your product. I think if you're worried about the efficacy and the UV output of your product, you need to push that back to the manufacturer and get the technical data sheets and, you know, question them, ask the question, because I think any good supplier would gladly receive those questions and put minds at ease. I don't think there's a reliable way to assess the UV output in the field, particularly with LED. But also I actually would say that it's a little bit difficult in fluorescent as well, because again, it depends on how far away you're holding it. There's just too many variables, I feel, to really know for sure.
There was a bit of a phase of surveyors going around with the meters, wasn't there, into the local butchers and going, your when did you have your fly killer tubes changed? Oh, my meter says that they haven't been changed for 2 years. And then the customer would be like, well, our technician changed them 6 months ago. Well, I don't think he did. I think you better get a different company in. So
again, I think
that's not going to happen with LED then.
Well, I guess just like LED in fluorescent, if depending on what brand you buy, whether you're buying kind of a high quality European made product or whether you're buying something that's slightly cheaper, the degradation over time is always going to fluctuate brand to brand. And so I don't think you can judge how long a lamp has been in situ, whether it's fluorescent or LED, depending on what a UV meter says. I just don't think that that's an accurate way of doing it. But I can understand the need to assess that. But I think the best way is to just follow the manufacturer's guidelines ultimately on when they say you need to replace the lamp.
I've got to say, with the Opti-Catch, because previously I did purchase a different LED unit and placed it in our office, and came in the morning, and I looked at it and thought, is that thing on? And I could just imagine putting it into a customer's site, and the customer going, the fly killer, it doesn't look very bright over there. I'm sure it's not attracting the flies. And I can just imagine, I can just hear that conversation. Whereas with the Opti-Catch, when we put them into a different unit, it was like, oh, you can actually. I know the actual light coming off of them isn't what's attracting it, but it gave you that sort of confidence that there's light coming out of the actual blooming thing.
Exactly. Sorry, go Alex. I know what you're going to say because I'm just as excited as you are.
Weirdly enough, it is it's not just UV light that is attractive to flying insects. Now, there's without a shadow of a doubt, UV light is a large attractant to flying insects. But anyone who, and I've heard this multiple times and I've seen it myself, couldn't get hold of a UV tube, so you've just nipped to the local, DIY store to just get a standard T15 bulb to stick it in that thing. But it's not. The light in itself has a tremendous sort of like impact on the behavior and movement.
It's so beautiful. The light.
Exactly that. There are some insects like moths which operate at night. They're probably not UV attracted because they've never experienced. They're nocturnal animals. Why would they have an element of their physiology that's UV at that point? They're looking at reflected light from the moon, arguably relatively low UV at that point. So my point being is actually not only is this visible light spectrum, in my opinion, important to clients because it gives that visible indicator of on, off, where it's pointing, what it's doing, but actually I believe that there are many species of insect out there where having a visible light in conjunction with your UV lamp which is going to be highly beneficial. I mean, Hugh, where are we told never to put a UV tube? Where do you never put an ILT?
Next to a window. Next to a door.
Next to a window, next to a door. Most windows, I'm led to believe these days, the glass and the films on the glasses are covered in a UV resistant material. Suddenly laminar glasses, the plastic in there has a UV barrier on it. Otherwise, all that lamination, all that plastic would start to degrade and go funny. So there is a UV ablative element in windows. So if it was just UV light attracting you, then windows would never be an issue, would they? And yet, very clearly, they are. So again, buying a bulb that has that dual aspect of both visible light and UV light, in my opinion, is much better than a bulb that is just purely UV, where you can definitely attract some insects, but not all of them.
And it definitely, for the customer, I think that the visual effect of that light is sort of saying, when you've got a customer and there's a fly flying around and the client can say, well, there's a fly killer out there, look. we're doing everything we can. Whereas if you say to a customer, fly colour up there, look, and the customer looks and goes, yeah, but it's not on, mate.
Exactly. That's exactly what we envisioned. When we started the development, we were under no illusion that you only really need UV. I mean, a lot of the competitor products only have UV chips, and so we could well have developed a product that just had UV chips running along it. But like you say, Hugh, consumers eat with their eyes, and for them to see that it's on, we wanted it to be as familiar as possible to fluorescent, and so the fluorescent UVA lamps that we all are used to, the dominant wavelength peak is at 368 nanometers, which is at which point insects become attracted, but there is a secondary peak at around 440, which is why they all have that slightly blue appearance to us, and it's because we can see the 440 nanometer secondary peak. And so really, to have just UV chips, like you say, they don't always look on, they don't look particularly bright. Now, that's not to say they're not putting out UV. We don't know either way because we can't see it. So it was kind of to reassure the customers that, the product is on. And also, like Alex says, it does seem to play a part because actually, our efficacy testing has shown that we benefit from having the blue chips there.
And this isn't just my imagination. Remember, for a while, let's go back 5, 6, 7, 8 years, Hugh, when we started to get a range of different UV tubes.
Green.
And the reason that was done wasn't just for aesthetics. There was a lot of genuine research done in that the different wavelengths had a more favorable output, and these are the visible wavelengths, had a more favorable output on a different range of pests. And I think it was, forgive me saying it's a little while back, but I think the green tubes were definitely more orientated towards things like, they were marketed as for lesser houseflies and things like that. Was that right? That's beyond my ken. I can't quite remember that, but I definitely know that they brought out a bulb with a different visible wavelength specifically to capture a different range of flying insects. So there is an impact there. It's not just me prattling.
No, you're right. You're right. The green tubes were always kind of marketed at a different range of insects than the traditional blue ones. But although some people buy them because they just like the green, but that's not what they were intended for. Yeah.
Talking of different tubes and different bulbs, that was going to be myth number 3, and it kind of came up there, and we kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, which is, you mentioned energy saving, and of course that is the big push. A lot of people are saying, if you swap over, you'll be saving energy, and because everyone has a green initiative. Oh, hang on, someone's mentioned something about the green. So Brian O'Donnell says, from memory, was the green not sold to have a full 12-month strength compared to the standard blue? I don't remember that. Do you remember that bit of marketing, Hugh?
No.
Oh, Brian, if you can find any information on that, chuck that in, because that's an interesting claim. But back to the costs, that's the number one sort of like push a lot of people have at the moment, is go LED because you're going to go green off the back of that. But again, with all of these myths, it's not as simple as it sounds, is it? Because I'll let you explain, Jasmin, as to why that is.
Yeah, of course. So I mean, ultimately, you're right. Energy savings are a huge positive for moving to LED, but I don't feel that should be at the cost of fly catch, because ultimately you still want a functional product. You don't want to say, oh, I'm saving all this energy, but I'm catching less flies, because that's not really what this is about. And so what we made sure was that when we developed our tube being 5 watts rather than the usual 15, we actually catch more flies than the 15 watt equivalent fluorescent, because energy savings are good, of course, but they're not the be all and end all when you've got a functional item that actually needs to do a job. So there's that. But also, based on a lot of the retrofit lamps that are starting to surface in market, you do need to make sure that it's of the kind of high quality circuitry that would mean that it actually is drawing the power that they tell you it's drawing. So when you retrofit it into the trap, we have power draw meters that show, for example, that an Opti-Catch lamp would take the power draw down from, for example, 2 by 15 watts would be pulling 30 watts plus the circuit losses, which is around 10% in fluorescent. When you take them out and put the Opti-Catch lamps in, you then drop the power draw right down to the 10 watts of the 2 tubes. So you're saving a good 2/3 of the energy. And so not everything is what it seems. You could take maybe a sort of cheaper substandard retrofit solution, and actually the circuitry is not kind of complicated enough or clever enough to actually reduce the power draw. And so that's.
Are you saying that all tubes are not equal?
I am absolutely saying that.
Okay, fair enough.
So again, it's another thing that you need to kind of push back at the supplier on, and actually quiz them on, do you have any evidence that this pulls the reduced power draw? Because, if anyone was to ask us that question, we've got the proof, we've got the evidence. And I think that is the bare minimum that a consumer deserves, is that transparency. So again, if you are investing in a retrofit LED product, which you've got all the benefits of not, your trap's not going to landfill, you don't need to have the rewire or the installation costs, you're not footing the bill for that. Also, it's important to make sure you're not compromising your fly catch, because what's the point? You don't want to catch less flies, you want to catch the same. But equally, you want to make sure that the power draw you're expecting to, the energy you're expecting to save is actually being saved. That's really important. And again, the proof is in the pudding. You need to push back to the suppliers and get the technical data sheets from them, or just challenge them. If someone's telling you something that sounds too good to be true, then ask to see the data. I think it's really important in the industry, because we don't want lots of flies buzzing around near our food, basically.
So very quickly, I mean, for the sake of people doing maths on their fingers, toes and thumbs, where is the energy loss when, if you've got a 15 watt tube and you're going to go down to a 5 watt LED? That seems like a huge jump. That's, that's a third of the power there. So is it the fact that fluorescent tubes are very ineffective, they're very inefficient, or is it the fact that LED tubes are much more effective? I mean, where are we losing 10 watts to still have the same output?
I would say the biggest difference between fluorescent and LED is actually the heat that's generated by the lamp. So fluorescent lamps are very, very hot to touch once they've been on a while. And so you're not really wasting too much energy in generating heat with LEDs. They run a lot cooler. There is some heat that they produce, but it's nowhere near like the levels of fluorescent. So straight away, you're wasting a lot of energy heating up the tube, which is not really needed for the function. That's just kind of a consequence of using a fluorescent lamp. So there's that, but also I think, you've touched on, is LED more efficient? I would say in some cases, yes, if you've got a good quality product. And so as technology improves, we just get more efficient in many walks of life, and this is probably one of them. But yeah, the heat is a huge loss of energy that is not really being used for anything in a fluorescent lamp.
So that brings me on to, go on. I've got myth number 4 coming up here, but Hugh.
You do myth number 4, and then I'll go.
So I've heard it said that because, for that very reason, that the heat output is not necessarily the same, that a lot of glue boards will not have the same level of efficacy, because actually it's the heat from the fluorescent tube that helps to sort of like make that glue board tacky and sticky. And if you take away that heat, if you take away that, artificial point source, and you put in an LED which is cold, inverted commas, then your glue board's not going to be as effective, and you might actually have to go and buy new glue boards or specialist glue boards or things like that. So is there any truth to that myth that that's the case?
I haven't personally seen any hard science behind that. But what I would say is that although LEDs are cooler, they are not cold. So there is still a little bit of heat that's being generated by them. Hugh, what's your hand up for?
Well, I can hopefully say that we've been field trialing them, and we've noticed no difference at all, because they're not getting very hot. In fact, they're catching more.
Yes, exactly, because I think, to be honest, if you were to change the glue to one that gets tackier at a lower temperature, which I assume is what the difference is between a fluorescent glue board and an LED glue board for those that are kind of pushing that, tackier glue, when fitted with any light source, is going to hold on to the insects just that little bit easier. But equally, having touched the glue board at room temperature with no lamps in front of it, it's still damn sticky. I don't think it actually needs to be heated up to, I think the flies have no hope, to be honest with you, because I can, stick my hand to it and I can feel that it's very, very tacky, which is exactly what it should be. So I don't personally subscribe to those comments that you need different glue for LED versus fluorescent. And Hugh, you can attest to that because you've done the field tests on the Opti-Catch, and you say that they're catching more flies even though they run at a cooler temperature. So that kind of debunks that.
We've used sticky boards at room temperature for catching cockroaches, so I don't see any problem with it at all.
With a little fly, it's going to have no hope, is it?
With a big glue board and they're dumping it.
Exactly. I mean, and also we've done independent laboratory testing. So the field testing is really, really important, and it gives us good kind of feedback. But ultimately, independent lab tests also confirm what you've said there, which is that, in a lab where we'd had the same kind of set of conditions, but we were compared the same brief with fluorescent, and then we did the same brief again with, our Opti-Catch, we actually again caught nearly 10% more flies. And so in that situation, the glue would have definitely been cooler with the Opti-Catch compared to the fluorescent, because fluorescents run hotter, but there was no negative impact on the fly catch efficacy. So again, the science I've seen would debunk what you're saying there, Alex.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I have to say, anyone who's you've not been doing pest control long enough if you've not got your gloves stuck on the corners of of a glue board, trying to wiggle it back out of one of those machines and back out the bottom. And if you've not left at least the thumb tips of your gloves behind on a glue board, you've just not done it right at the end of the day. It's one of those things. Everyone gets stung once. Everyone leaves great big thumbprints on glue boards, and you're shaking your head. You've never left a bit of glove behind on a glue board, Hugh. Yeah.
I know somebody that got a smoke generator stuck on their hand because of glue. And it was it was my old supervisor, and it was one of those old Lindane 40Ts, the metal ones.
They go hot.
Oh yeah. He said he was squeaking a bit and he just couldn't get it off of his hand, because it was actually tack when you used to make your own sticky boards, and he got a bit on the actual tin, and of course you grab the tin like that, don't you? I don't know why you grabbed the tin, or he lit the match and grabbed the tin and went like that, and then it was like, oh, 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 oh. So I just brought back a memory.
I've seen a comment from Kieran asking about cost comparisons.
I was going to do that one.
Whilst that's obviously going to vary, I mean, you can ask for Opti-Catch from your usual, wherever you buy your fluorescent lamps from. If you ask for Opti-Catch, they should be able to supply it to you. And if you have any trouble with that, then just reach out to us and we can help. But what I would say is, although I can't tell you what the cost would be because I don't know where you buy from, as a general rule, when we look at the cost of energy, the energy savings, and the fact that it's a 3-year product versus 1 year on fluorescent, the price point that we're expecting this to roll out at, it does actually pay for itself in the 3 years. So although it's a bit of a higher outlay than fluorescent, you've recovered that before you replace the lamp in 3 years' time. So actually the costs stack up really nicely there.
And does that actually include like not chucking the unit away, or is that just purely the cost saving on the tubes?
Oh, sorry, I see what you're saying. Yes, so that is based on just the cost of the tube and the energy saving, and the fact that you'd have 3 fluorescent lamps over the course of 1 Opti-Catch product. So I mean, if you factored in the
buying a new unit,
then it stacks up even further. Yeah.
So if you're buying a new unit, then straight away it's going to, you're going to be at a deficit, aren't you? But yeah, I think what people then forget is it's not just the cost of, one LED retrofit is the same cost as three bulbs, because of course those bulbs are running at 3 times the power, which means that actually the cost savings to your client are significant. We've all seen how much electricity costs these days. I mean, Hugh, what is it? You've got, what you say, 50 AFKs on a site, each one running at an additional 10 watts each. So that's another
Yeah.
100, that's another 500 watts. That's equivalent. So your kettle runs at, what is it?
Probably not as many as 50, but yeah.
It's still, let's say 100,
a lot.
for every 150 EFK, or each 75 EFKs where you've got 2 bulbs in there, it's 150 bulbs. 150, that's 1.5 kilowatts, roughly maths, for those 500 units. Anyway, it's like running a kettle all year round. You can run the maths on that.
So, okay, there's your, I don't know, I don't want to say any trade names, but there's your 30-watt fly killer hanging on the wall, okay, and there's a equivalent LED unit, okay. Is that, because obviously somebody at some stage, a surveyor, is going to go in and say, you don't want that, you want this new LED unit over here. And somebody's going to say, well, I can just put 2 LED tubes in that. If you put them side by side, a specific LED unit and a retrofitted Opti-Catch unit of the same make and the same type, is there any difference in power? Is there any benefit from having a specifically designed LED unit?
I think that the answer to that would depend on who you ask, firstly. But what we found in all of our independent testing is that the lamp form factor, so there's something about it being a traditional looking lamp with the pins at the end and the rounded glass envelope, something about that seems to promote higher efficacy than the kind of flat strips of LED diodes running across. And so we've seen a correlation between lamp form factor actually outperforming the kind of generic LED modules. Now, I do think that it's case by case, isn't it? Because you look at the marketing material of all of these different traps on the market and they all claim to have the best catch. So I think asking for the actual data behind it is a really good way of, and again, people don't have time for that. I appreciate that.
Is that like buying a Vauxhall diesel and then 5 years later finding out it was supposed to have done 85 miles to the gallon and it only does 40?
Exactly. You do have to take everything with a pinch of salt. But to answer your question, it seems there's a positive difference between using the traditional lamp form factor that we all have become used to compared to a new kind of LED module, which perhaps doesn't, for whatever reason.
But there's no power difference. So a specifically made LED unit isn't going to have any more saving than an Opti-Catch.
They're all different. They're all different voltages, actually. But generally speaking, the 5 watts that we're using in the Opti-Catch is on par generally with what the other LED units are claiming to draw. But of course, it's going to vary from brand to brand.
Yeah.
There's one thing I'd like to throw in here to really muddy the waters. So previously, I've also done research on the ILT units, not the bulbs themselves, but the ILTs themselves. And what I found by far and away is some units, the bulbs are quite hidden. They're integrated inside the machines. They're actually the bulbs, for either cosmetic reasons, for other reasons, you can't necessarily see from the floor the bulbs. And in some instances, that's great. But you've got to bear in mind that these are operating under the premise that something has to be able to see those bulbs. It has to be flying within sight of that emitted spectra of light. And so the more complicated some of these actual base units are, some of them have been really well thought out, and but some of them they obscure the light so badly that the insects can no longer get to them. So again, it's the joy of having the flexibility here is what I'm saying is you can now mix and match A to B, whereas some units can be very, they fight against themselves, is all I'm going to say, because they block the light from coming out with
Do you remember
bells and whistles.
Do you remember the Rentokil D4 units that had a grid on them, electric grid? And I remember Rentokil did a little bit of a study, and it did depend greatly on which way round. So you either had the grid in front of the tubes or the grid behind the tubes. And the actual difference was quite considerable with the grid behind the tubes, with the actual light being given out, even though they were just like little bars. So that was off on tangent.
No, but you're right in that it's a functional item. So you need to be able to see the light distribution in order for it to function well, which again, it plays on the unique diffusion coating that we've developed, which rather than just having one kind of thin strip of the UV, which is being kind of spotted out, it widens that beam angle, which means that you've got a greater chance of the insect actually being attracted. So again, depending on the unit you put it in, they've all got different cutouts, haven't they? So they all let light out in different areas. To maximize your efficacy, you just want as wide a beam angle as possible, because then you're just attracting as many insects as you possibly can.
So, I mean, that's one of the big benefits of fluorescent, isn't it? Because it's a 360-degree emission from the point of, the center of that bulb, which means that you're getting as much light going vertically up as you got vertically down. And arguably at that point, you've got as much light going backwards onto the board, which is not, unless you're very smart with your board construction, not particularly useful at that point. But just, do you know off the top of your head what is that envelope that we're looking at there? What does a traditional LED do in terms of that emitted envelope?
So they do all create different actually, but yes, it's a very narrow beam angle because it's just very directional. And what we found, so what we did was we tested our lamps with our diffusion coating and without. So if you imagine without the diffusion coating, it's got the chips in a row just like any other LED product. And so when we tested it without the diffusion coating, we caught 14% less flies than with the diffusion coating. So again, it's the same base product, but just adding that diffusion over top, and it widened that beam angle. And when we measure, there's about 50% more UV back on the glue board with the diffusion than without, which again, that's where you want to attract the insects to go.
And I find this is, I think, feeding into Brian's comment. So Brian's saying unit placement would make a bigger impact to efficacy than power output. But from what you're saying there, Jasmin, actually, this diffusion coating, it takes away a bit of that error factor. It gives you a bit more latitude to, if you've not got it precisely at, 12.5 feet off the floor, because that's the sweet spot for that. It actually gives you a bit more latitude in where you can put that board, because you have a broader envelope for that.
Certainly, yeah. If you compare a product that's got our unique diffusion coating applied to it, the Opti-Catch is going to have a better chance at attracting the insects that are sort of passing, compared to if you had the same placement of a trap that's just got one line of LEDs, because they have to, the flies are going to have to fly much more in the path of the UV than the trap that has the diffusion and it's kind of spreads more evenly around. So yeah, definitely that would help that.
So I don't think.
Sorry, Q.
So the tubes actually come with a separate starter, don't they?
They do, yes. So well, you've seen them. It looks exactly like the starter that you would normally use for the switch start fluorescent fittings. The only difference is that it's actually a dummy starter, so it just bridges the circuit and allows the lamp to retrofit into your existing trap. So those don't actually come with the lamp, but they are just a separate consumable, just like the starters are that you would use on fluorescent.
Do they last well?
Yeah, so you wouldn't necessarily need to replace the starter. You know, at the end of the 3 years when you're replacing the lamp, it's literally just a bridge. There's not really any complexity to those starters. So once you've bought a dummy starter, I wouldn't expect you to need to buy one every time you buy a new Opti-Catch lamp. It can kind of sit there quite happily. It is just very important that you make sure you use a dummy starter, you know, the Opti-Catch branded ones, because the normal starters are not going to do very well with LED. They're going to upset.
It was just, I remember there are some companies that automatically change the fluorescent starters. They change the tube, they change the starter. Well, you know, for us, we've not changed some starters for 10 years. It's like, what?
Yeah.
It's not broke. Don't just leave it in there. Why replace it? It does the job.
I agree. And also, you know, there's, again, it's the sustainability of it's just a needless little bit of plastic. If you don't actually need to replace it, why would you? And that's why we don't actually include a starter with every lamp. You'll see that some retrofit solutions have a starter on the end of every single lamp. And whilst that is probably quite convenient when you're first relamping, from there afterwards, it's actually very wasteful. It's a wasteful piece of plastic that you likely don't need. And so that's why we think, well, let's treat it separate like it is in the fluorescent space now. You wouldn't buy a starter with a fluorescent lamp. And we think that lends itself much better to being a little bit less wasteful, like you say.
So I have a question, and I don't know if you've done the tests on this, but it was a thought that just crossed my mind. But with having this sort of like much more, you know, and arguably diffusion factors aside, it is a more focused beam than fluorescence. Does this impact the distance away from the unit? He says, getting his hands as far as away, that is effective for picking up flies, because at the moment, fluorescent tubes, we've got a good idea as to how far into a room that unit will reach before it starts, you know, before we have to start putting up another unit or maybe hanging one in the center of a room or something like that. But with LED technology, it just broadly, you know, across the board, can you get further across a room with an LED than you can with a fluorescent tube? Are you getting a better radius?
So in answer to that, I would say I don't know what the others are testing to and what they're checking against in terms of what other manufacturers are claiming in that regard. But what I can say is that obviously there is a way to measure this, and it's the watts per meter squared. So we have benchmarked to make sure that, you know, if we're selling the Opti-Catch lamp as a 15 watt equivalent, it needs to be as good or better in that regard than the 15 watt. But, you know, the 15 watt lamp that everyone is used to. So yes, we do make sure that our product it has at least the reach it should, if not more. But I can't speak for everyone in that. I think that it might be something that perhaps others possibly have overlooked. I don't know. I've not looked at the data. But I guess it's dependent, isn't it, on the chips that are used and the quality of the product as to how well the UV sort of spreads.
So you started with the 15 watt equivalent. Are there other tubes down the line coming in?
Yes, we have identified a roadmap, which is essentially the most popular fluorescent lamps are obviously going to be the ones that we move over to Opti-Catch first, because they're the ones, you know, in biggest demand. But what we do plan to do is have a full range, so that essentially any fluorescent trap that someone's got that they want to continue using, we would aim over the coming kind of months, years, to have a solution that they can retrofit with. I mean, the real obscure ones, you know, there's always some random obscure thing that you've never seen before.
Tight fit
that might be a bit of an ask, but generally the ones that are kind of you see daily, we would like to have a full retrofit.
What, even the circline?
Because I mean, nothing's impossible. You know, okay. Circline is a very popular tube, so yes, we would.
Very expensive tube.
They are, yes, yeah, they are. But I think it's quite difficult to shape the glass in that circular fashion. I think it's quite a high
so why did they ever do it? Why did they ever do it?
Because it looks pretty, man. Come on.
It does look
pretty.
Yeah.
You know, fluorescent tube, £1.50, circline, £6.
But
I didn't say it was cheap. I said it was pretty.
Yeah.
Form
I
over
guess it
function.
depends on. Yes, exactly. I guess it depends on what people, what their preferences are.
Yeah.
So, Hugh, by the way, for anyone who's listening to this that hasn't ever met Hugh before, Hugh's preference for anything is the cheaper version. If you can
Cheaper
get a
that
deal on it,
works.
yeah.
But cheap isn't always cheerful, as they say.
No, that's right. Can't buy fluorescent tubes from Temu.
No, I wouldn't recommend it. I've not seen them on there, but I wouldn't recommend it.
Probably blow up after about 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So going back then, so we've all made a decision that we're going to go start using Opti-Catch tubes. Where are we going to get them from again?
So ideally, just wherever you would normally buy your fluorescent lamps from, your consumables, you should be able to source them from there. Just specify that you want an Opti-Catch product, and they should be able to service you. If you have any trouble with that, then please do get in touch, and we can point you in the direction of a distributor that will be able to supply you. But definitely ask your normal supplier first, because they should have them.
Disposal.
Ooh,
Yes.
That's a good one.
Are they going back to Reccolite, the absolute pig's arse that is Reccolite?
Unfortunately, that's still the case. I mean, so they are applicable. So just like fluorescent, when you buy a fluorescent lamp, you have already paid for the eventual disposal of that lamp, and so you do just need to take it to the local site, whether it's Ricolite or anything like that. And so the Opti-Catch LED lamps are applicable as well, which I know you can say it's a bit of a faff, but it is, at least reassures you that they're being disposed of responsibly, and that the disposal is kind of paid for.
450 quid for a box.
But Hugh, you only have to do it every 3 years now.
There is that.
Well done, Alex. That's absolutely true. Once every 3 years instead of once every year. But also, you have already paid for the recycling of the product, meaning that if you were to take them yourself to the recycling site, you shouldn't be charged any more.
No, they just turn around and say, no, not in this box, mate.
Okay, that's interesting. The whole point of the recycling scheme is that the disposal is paid for at point of purchase. So it's kind of passed from the manufacturers down through the supply chain, essentially. So that doesn't sound good. I thought you were referring to the collection fees, because those can get quite costly if you get them collected.
Oh, yeah. We had a situation where we had 1,000 tubes to get rid of. And we couldn't, we asked to take them in bits to the various Reccolite places or the suppliers, and they were like, no, you can't bring them here, mate. Can't bring them here. You'd have to phone up a week in advance and see if we've got space. If we've got space, you can bring them in. Well, every time I rung up, they would never let us take any tubes there. So eventually,
that's not good.
Yeah, Reccolite buckled in the end after I complained and sent a box free of charge. But after the next time I tried to do it, they wanted a lot of money for their box.
Yeah, so that's where they get you.
Yeah.
But
it's only a box.
But no, the recycling scheme is unchanged from fluorescent to the Opti-Catch. So as much as that's probably not what you wanted to hear, I suppose you wanted me to tell you you can just put them in a normal bin. But unfortunately, no, you can't do that. But that would be the case for any LED product. They should.
But you can if they're broken.
If they're broken, they won't be broken.
If a fluorescent tube is broken, you can put it in the bin, but you can't. You've got to recycle it if it's still whole.
Right. Okay.
Don't
I
put your fluorescent tube just to stick them in bins, Hugh. That is you reversing over a box of them in the car park, being like, "See,
oh, what was that? Oh, crunch."
Don't.
No, we've got a big box. We've got a box.
Yeah. Or you could make sure they have FEP coating, shatterproof coating on them, and then it's not going to be too messy when you run them over.
That's not the take home we want from this.
Don't run over lamps to avoid having to recycle them. That's not good.
Yeah, no, that's not.
I was about to say, we've just
Every
got
3
4 big
years.
myths. And 4 big myths, and we've got 10 minutes left. And so desperately, is there another myth that anyone wants covered off about fluorescent tubes versus UV tubes that we can do? Because 5 is a much rounder number for my OCD than 4 is.
That's an
No
odd number,
pressure.
5.
It's part of the log 10 system. It's better.
Even, odd. Even, odd.
I am odd. Jasmin, can you think of any other sort of common myths that you think would be worth debunking at this point about LED tubes over fluorescent tubes?
I think we've covered them, I think we've covered the good ones. Nothing else springs to mind.
I'm quite converted.
What?
I'm quite converted. With the field trial that we've done, and not having to store loads and loads of tubes is a big plus. And not having to put an order in eventually every single year, once every 3 years. That certainly makes a difference. Not having to store loads and loads of tubes, dead tubes up.
I've got one, and this is going to sound bizarre. We've all bulged up at some point and had a fluorescent tube go pop in your hand. Hopefully it's got a shatterproof coat and it's not the end of the world, but we've all had gone in the days well before. All right, there's another question there. That's a better question of mine, because I was about to say, how durable are the LED units? If you drop it on the floor, is it going to break? If it's going to rattle about in the back of your car, is it going to break? But how strong is the actual construction of the material in the tubes? Obviously you're not going to try and bend it over your knee, but
I was going to say it's still glass, so I wouldn't recommend mishandling it, because it's actually, quite dangerous, because it's, you've bought that product, you want to use it. But of course, there's no vacuum in the same way like a fluorescent lamp would go pop, as you described it. You're not going to have that quite the same with an LED product, because there's no vacuum inside. So I wouldn't say they're more or less robust. I haven't thrown any around, to be honest with you, so I can't really put that theory to the test.
You can have a try.
But all you can do is make sure you have shatterproof coating, so that you are not in any harm's way should you break any lamps.
I did have a standard tube shatter in my hand. That was quite painful.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah.
And I bet that went everywhere as well.
Yeah, right in the...
Kind of what I was getting at there, so they're more robust in the sense that if you do get a crack in the coating, it's not going to blow up in your hand like a standard or an coated tube is, because it's not under pressure, it's not under vacuum. So there's probably a little latitude for that. But no, back to someone else's question, because that was dumb from me. I was just having an idle thought. Chris Wright from LinkedIn is asking driver replacements for LED modules against EM ballast life. So, is that something you can answer?
So, I think what we're talking about here is if you think about new LED units that all obviously do have a ballast within them, the ballast itself is probably an electronic ballast, which perhaps will only last 5 years, maybe. Whereas an EM ballast, which is the ballast that we're talking about retrofitting into, so the ones that use the switch start, they can go and go and go for years to come. I mean, you've probably seen yourself, Hugh, how many traps can just keep just going and going. Maybe you replace the starter now and then, maybe you replace the lamps, but the ballast itself is working for many years. Yeah. Whereas some of the electronic ballasts in new LED units don't have quite that longevity, because it's a little bit more of a complex circuitry. And my understanding is in the market, it's not going to be very well received to expect PCOs technicians to rewire and replace.
Oh, it's a bitch.
Now, in general lighting, there's something called circular economy, which is where the fitting that you put up on the wall or on the ceiling needs to be repairable. And that means that all parts can be repairable rather than taking it off the ceiling and replacing it with a new fitting every time something goes wrong. So if we were to see those regulations move over into pest control special lighting, then yes, in theory, you would need components that have that longevity or can be replaced and repairable. So again, retrofitting with Opti-Catch is another kind of way of achieving that circular economy, because you're not sending something to landfill, you are reusing what you've got.
Cool. I think we've covered so much ground on tonight's podcast. I mean, like, this has been probably one of my...
How did we manage to do that about a fly killer tube?
I know, I was thinking...
Hour and a half.
Yeah, we've done well there.
Yeah, absolutely. It's got me going and thinking. And
no, you've done well.
Then again, I love a good technical chat anyway, because I'm a nerd. So there we go. But I mean, Jasmin, thank you ever so much for joining us tonight. Do you have any questions for us? Opportunity. Do you have any questions for either Hugh or I before we jump into the famous last three?
Ooh, what would be, and it might be more Hugh because you've got your sort of feet on the ground, but what would you say is your biggest objection that you receive from customers when you talk to them about LED as a whole? Like, what is the biggest problem in moving to LED for the market?
Well, obviously, initially, it would be actual fly killer replacement, having to replace a whole fly killer. You know, you've got a fly killer that's on the wall and is working, and you're going to turn around to them and say, well, you're going to have to give us 350 quid for a new fly killer unit. So that was the initial big, you know, whatever you said, the saving over the next 5 years would be, it'd be like, we don't care. We might not be here in 5 years. But whereas hopefully with retrofitting fly killer tubes, that's going to make quite a considerable difference when we can sit down and do a few figures, work out how much it's going to cost them, how much the quarterly fee is going to be for servicing, and then put that against the cost saving of not only actually the electrical saving, but the cost or the saving of not replacing the unit.
And just having a thought, you know, in terms of maths there, let's say you've got a 10 ILT site and you want to change all of them overnight, which is going to be impossible. By your maths, that's $3.5 grand straight away on new units potentially. But
that's exactly...
Yeah. But if you with the retrofit, you don't actually have to change every bulb on the site, do you? You could easily come to a thing where you just, you know, section the north, you do, you know, quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, quarter 4. You can bring them in phases as you go along.
You could even do it year by year, couldn't you? Start now. Start now.
Just during your yearly replacement, just replace. You know, as you'd be replacing the tube anyway, just replace it with an Opti-Catch. And like you say, you don't have to do all of the areas in one go. Yeah,
I mean,
that's
I don't
a
know.
good point.
I don't know about most people, but we tend to just do all of ours on one cycle.
That makes sense because you know when it's due. Yeah.
Yeah. So cycle 3 for us is tube change time, and it's the same every year. Cycle 3. It's going to take you that much longer during that cycle, but
cycle 3, Q3.
No,
you change your bulb. I was about to say
cycle 3, 8 routines a year.
Oh right, okay.
8 routines a year. So your fly killer services are 1, 3, 5, and 7.
Okay,
and then your fly killer tube changes on cycle 3.
Right, because I was
so
about
that
to
will
say,
obviously change.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was about to say, if you're changing your bulbs after summer, then by the time summer comes around, 70%. Don't do that. Sorry. That's basic, man. Do you want to lead? Do you want to start?
I can do, by all means. So now we've had a successful podcast with you, Jasmin. Have you enjoyed your time on the podcast?
I have loved it. Thank you very much for having me.
Good.
It's been a real pleasure to have you on, because I know we've been chatting for quite some time to try and get you onto the podcast. So actually having you on the podcast finally is really great. So I'm really pleased that you've enjoyed yourself, and we've had this opportunity. So go on then.
Yes.
Give us a shameless plug. I have a feeling I might know what it is, but surprise us. What's your shameless plug going to be?
My shameless plug is probably going to be Opti-Catch, because then you can upgrade to LED with all the benefits and the energy saving without compromising your fly catch and actually catching more flies than the fluorescent equivalent.
God, do you know what? I'm going to say that's one of the best shameless plugs we've had.
Wow,
Yeah.
I'll take it.
Because it's actually plugging up. Most people are just like, well, it's straight to the point, and it's actually, yeah, cool. And so if you had to pick anybody, who would you like to see on the podcast? If anybody.
Oh, I do have a good one. I would like to see Tom Holmes, who has recently gone independent as a consultant to the industry. And I think he's got a wealth of knowledge and would be really good.
Okay. I will.
Yeah,
Send him a message.
He's a nice guy. He was in Pelsis, and then he disappeared off, I think, to go and sell stoves for a little while, and then he's come back
Something
again.
Like that, yeah.
Leader of Pelsis E-Deluxe, and now he's gone independent. He's joined the world of the consultants, and we have a bare, we do not have enough consultants on our industry. So another one joining the ranks is, well, don't look at me like that, Hugh. Name me 5 consultants we've got in this industry, and I'll buy you dinner.
Consultants for specifically pest control.
Yeah.
You? Well, no longer.
Well, no, yeah, okay. Let's count me as a half.
You can be a half. Oliver?
He's around here. I'll give you Ollie.
Chris Parmenter. I think there's a guy called Richard Clark. Tom Holmes. That's 5.
That's cheating.
Is there Elaine's Pest Fix, isn't she?
Yeah.
So would she be classed as a consultant?
Not independent, no.
Oh, independent consultant. Independent. I'm struggling now.
Exactly my point.
Struggling now.
Exactly that.
Oh,
and
one more.
We've got Paul from Veritas coming on as well.
Oh, Paul Westgate, yes.
Yeah, there we go. I owe you dinner. But still, my point remains. My dad, who runs Wade Environmental now. Yes, okay. 6.
6.
Thank you, Joe. But my point is, we need more consultants in this industry. We need more people stepping into that breach, because 6, off the top of your head, 6 independent consultants in a pool of 10,000 pest managers in an industry that covers 4 devolved nations, and it's not a lot. That is basically a little over 1 per devolved nation in the UK. That's not.
There are more, but I can't remember their names because I've sent them all invites to the podcast.
But the point being is, we don't have great representation. So yeah, I'd love to have Tom on. I'd love to have Paul on, and I'd love to have Niall saying Akita, not independent. They're a group at this point. They're not. Anyway, let's not talk about consultants anymore. Let's let you all get to your Betty buys before you all turn into pumpkins. Jasmin, thank you ever so much for being on again. It's been an absolute treat. And look at that, I didn't mention our driving trip in Denver once.
Well, now you have.
Now I have. So I'll leave that one hanging there. And if anyone wants to find the story about how Jasmin very, very nearly killed me in America, then drop her a message and just ask. I'm sure she will tell you.
She might not answer.
She might not answer. Go on, but give it a go anyway. Anyway, for me, that'll be goodbye. Jasmin, once again, thank you ever so much.
Bye.
And we'll see you all next week.
Thank you for listening to the Beauties and Beasties podcast.